Hi class, welcome back if you are continuing on from our 1301 discussions, and welcome if you are just finding me here discussing these chapters from the American Yawp. Now these are intended to be short, brief reviews, less than 15 minutes, to just give you an overview of the material within the chapters. It's certainly not going to be complete. There's always some things that are going to be skipped over. It's important that you continue on your studies with the textbook itself. Now this chapter, chapter 16, Capital and Labor, is going to explore the massive economic changes during the late 19th century in the United States, and as industrial capitalism surges and society will be reshaped by it. Now we'll look at the rise of big business, the transformation of labor, and also the struggles between capitalists and workers as well. So let's get started. Now, in the late 1800s, the United States had become the world's leading industrial power. Now, we're still lagging behind some other nations, but that will not be a situation that lasts for long. This transformation is fueled by technological innovation, the expansion of railroads, and of course big business as well, factories, which will be built across cities, across the country, and then goods will be produced at an unprecedented scale. Powerful industrialists, called robber barons by their critics, are going to amass large fortunes. Andrew Carnegie, for example, will dominate the steel industry. Andrew Carnegie is going to develop something called vertical integration. He owns every bit of the process for producing his steel. John D. Rockefeller has a near monopoly in oil with the Standard Oil Company, controlling almost 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. And he uses horizontal integration, where many companies that produce the same thing all sort of fall underneath his banner. So as you start going through the textbook and you see these terms, be sure you understand what vertical and horizontal integration means a bit more in depth than I've given you right now. What were the purpose of both of these? To consolidate power, to drive competitors out of business, and to turn these companies into industrial empires. Now, the rise of big business is going to create new economic opportunities, but it's also going to spark concerns about wealth concentration and the unchecked power of corporations. So by the late 19th century, just a handful of men will control much of the nation's economy. And this is going to lead many to question whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Whether industrial capitalism is a benefit or a curse for the nation, and how is all this, is it being shared equitably? Those are conversations that will start to be had in rooms with important people around the nation. Now, the railroads are going to play a crucial role in the rise of American capitalism, and we first started talking about railroads back in Chapter 8 in Volume 1 of the American Yawp during the Market Revolution. But by the time we reach the post-Civil War period, we've got vast regions across the country that are connected, and railroads are going to make it possible to transport goods, raw materials, and people more effectively than ever before. And the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 was monumental in its achievement. It symbolized the promise of a unified national market. Before, it took weeks, if not months, to cross the nation. Now you could go from New York all the way to California in about 6 days. And goods could be shipped equally as fast. But the expansion of railroads do come at a cost. Thousands of workers, including many immigrants from China and Ireland, are going to toil under brutal conditions to lay down these tracks across the country. It takes months, if not years, and many are going to perish as these railroads are going to be built through very, very difficult conditions. Meanwhile, railroad tycoons like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who first got rich when as a steamboat magnate, they're going to make enormous profits, often exploiting workers, engaging in shady business practices, bribery, monopolistic pricing, and in many cases working in some less than legal ways with members of Congress. And so we're going to see a lot of scandals come out of the government around railroad and railroad expansion of the 1860s and the 1870s. Now, the power of railroads will lead to widespread discontent. Farmers, small businesses, and workers are going to feel that railroad companies held too much control over shipping rates, and they began to call for government regulation to curb the power of these corporations. Now, what about labor, the people doing the work? Now, with the rise of industrial capitalism came a dramatic shift in the lives of American workers. Factories demanded long hours. Sometimes we're talking 12 to 16 hours a day, oftentimes 6 to 7 days a week. These conditions were many times dangerous for very, very low pay. Workers included men, women, and children, and there's no such thing as child labor laws just yet. And these folks lived in overcrowded, unsanitary tenement housing most of the time. Now, as a result, labor movements began to emerge, and we talked about those also back in Chapter 8 of the American Yawp Volume 1, because we started having people being very discontent with the fact that they're not working for themselves anymore. They're working for somebody else, and that means they are not in control of their own destiny and certainly not in control of their own price. What your price was what you traded your time for, economically, monetarily. Well, you are now at the mercy of what your boss is willing to pay you now. Workers started to organize into unions to demand better wages, shorter hours, safer working conditions, and some of the more notable labor organizations of the period, the Knights of Labor, sometimes I'll refer to them as the K of L, and the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Now, the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, aimed to create a broad coalition of workers to push for social reforms. They're going to have both skilled and unskilled workers, and their populace is going to be somewhat radical. In fact, a certain labor strike at a place called Haymarket in Chicago is going to pretty much kill the Knights of Labor, when a number of police officers are going to be killed in that Haymarket riot. The AFL will be led by Samuel Gompers early on, and it'll focus more on immediate economic gains for skilled workers, better wages, better conditions, and so on and so forth. 40-hour work week will be another thing that many of them will be asking for. And the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 is going to be one example here. So the struggle between labor and capital will be an example where we see violence. Again, the Great Railroad Strike will see an outbreak in violence as well. Triggered by wage cuts, the strike spread across the country. It paralyzes the railroads. It leads to a number of violent confrontations between workers and law enforcement. And it's a clear sign that tensions between laborers and industrialists are beginning to reach a boiling point by this particular decade. Now, several major strikes during the period highlights the intense struggles between workers and business owners. I mentioned the Haymarket affair, the Haymarket riot, 1886. So this becomes a defining moment in labor history. And of course, it kills the Knights of Labor. A peaceful labor rally, at first calling for an 8-hour workday, turned violent when somebody threw a bomb in amongst a group of gathered police officers. This had resulted in some violence that had broken out, some clashes a few days prior. And the resulting chaos left several dead, and the event led to a national backlash against labor unions in general, and the Knights of Labor in particular, because again, working with skilled and unskilled, many of the unskilled laborers had come out of Europe, and many of them brought anarchist-type ideas. And violence was often used in some of those European countries in anarchist sort of movements, starting back in 1848, as far back as some of the communist uprisings of several countries in 1848. Now, major strikes during this period highlight the intense struggles between workers and business owners. And so, again, Haymarket's a great example. Other key conflicts, including the Homestead Strike of 1892. These are steel workers at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Plant. They're fighting against wage cuts. The strike turned deadly when workers and private security forces, the Pinkertons, this is going to be a major setback for the labor movement. Heads start getting broken. A number of folks are going to be killed when these strikes break out, these clashes break out. 2 years later, the Pullman Strike in 1894. It starts as a strike against wage cuts and high rent in the company town of Pullman. You rented your home from the company that employed you. They're raising not only the price of your rent, but lowering the price of your pay. And it escalates into a national railroad strike again. And federal troops are called in to break up the strike, demonstrating a willingness of the government to intervene on behalf of big business. And what was their reason for breaking up the strike? Well, the mail is delivered by train. You're hindering the trains from rolling down the tracks. You're hindering the mail. Therefore, you are breaking federal law. And so that's going to be the reason that the government uses for breaking up the Pullman strike in the 1890s. These strikes are going to reveal deep division of labor between labor and capital, and it's going to underscore the challenges that workers are going to face in fighting for economic justice. And they also highlight the growing power of the federal government, which often sides with big business, with industrialists over the workers. Now, the inequalities produced by industrial capitalism, this is going to lead to a range of social and political responses. And reformers known as progressives sought to address the problems caused by industrialization. This includes labor exploitation, urban poverty, and political corruption, for example. Now, some major figures, and maybe we'll talk about them a little bit farther down the road, that's going to step up and take a stand. One of them might be Jane Addams. Now, Jane Addams is going to found a settlement house to help urban poor, many of which are immigrants coming from European countries and don't speak English, maybe don't have a whole lot of education, and they're being taken advantage of. The settlement house was a place to live, to take English classes, maybe provided some medical care, and to raise the standard and the quality of living for some of these individuals. And like I say, in the case of Jane Addams and Hull House, this is in Chicago. But most major cities would have a version of this. Muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, discusses about how awful conditions, nasty conditions in the meatpacking plant. He was a socialist. He was really wanting government to take over business, but that's not the message that came from his book. What came from his book was our food supply is nasty and we need to clean it up, which we do with the Pure Food and Drug Act during the Theodore Roosevelt administration. So in the political arena, there's a growing pressure to rein in the power of big business. And the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 is one of the first attempts to regulate monopolies to prevent corporate abuses. Now, though initially weak, this legislation will lay the foundation for future government efforts to try to limit the influence of corporations and to try to basically prevent monopolies, which can hinder competition and can also lead to some rising prices oftentimes. Now, despite the setbacks of the labor union, the labor movement continues to push for better conditions, and many of the goals that the workers fought for, like 8-hour workday, safer working conditions, the right to organize, these eventually will be part of mainstream reforms in the 20th century. About 5 chapters down the road, the period of time that we will call the progressive movement, we see many of these things come into place. So that wraps up chapter 16 of the American Yawp. The late 19th century was a time of dramatic growth, economic growth, but also inequality as well. Industrial capitalism is going to create incredible wealth, sometimes called the Golden Age of America, but also sometimes referred to as the Gilded Age. It's bright and shiny on the surface, but underneath there's sort of a cheap underlying base in which all this is built upon. It sparks fiery debates about the rights of workers and the power of big businesses, and it just quite frankly is what we see as a growing pain coming out of the great changes, or the massive changes, maybe not great, but massive changes coming out of the American Civil War, which is our nation's turning point. So be sure to like and subscribe to this for more videos. I'm going to continue to build this even after I release my playlist to my classes, and over time I may even tackle some individual topics beyond just the textbook. So if you want to see more of that, hit subscribe, like it if you found this helpful, and I will see you on the next video. Take care.